can you maybe sit or, yeah.
It's better to use a speaker.
I'll try to project. Okay, so I just want to tell you how delighted I am to be here. I mean, being brought out of retirement by my very favorite leader of the activist movement, Shannon Blair, who is taking over for speaking to this young enthusiastic group is kind of like reminds me of being back in the early 1980s when we were a vigorous, enthusiastic, and strong movement. That was a long time ago, and perhaps we can see a rebirth of that here in this room. That's the feeling I get from you all. So everything I'm going to share with you tonight is available online on something called theveganblog.org. There are about 60 essays, and they all cover the material that I'm covering tonight and much more. So I encourage you to go and visit there at your leisure. Tonight I want to cover three topics. First, a little bit about the history of the movement. Then what it is that we're really after. You may think you know, but I would like to challenge what you think you know. And finally, what we're all about, which is changing hearts and minds. What works, what doesn't work so well. And if I could get a glass of water,
Yes.
that would be good. All right, so the first question is, how did we get here? So the concern about using animals for food goes back about 3 millennia. Back in 800, before the Common Era, the Israel's so-called later prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Hosea, condemned animal sacrifices and consumption of animal flesh. The next century, which would be the 6th century before the Common Era, Vardhamana Mahavira, who founded Jainism, and about the same time, still in northern India, the Buddha, both advocated not using animals for food. Unfortunately, the billions of Buddhists today don't follow the Buddha's teachings on that. About the same time, still roughly the 6th century before the Common Era, Greek philosophers, particularly Pythagoras, was an advocate of not eating animals. His student Plato was also vegetarian, and I'm not using the term vegetarian yet because back then the term didn't exist. Back then it was called the Pythagorean diet after Pythagoras. For many, many years, for centuries, it was called the Pythagorean diet. So that's where we were until the 4th century. But then one of Plato's, so Pythagoras, then Plato was his student, and then one of Plato's students named Aristotle disagreed. Aristotle felt that animals were created by God for human use, that they were mindless machines, and that they did not deserve any special consideration. Paul, the founder of Christianity, many people think that Jesus founded Christianity. Well, of course, he was the pioneer, but most of Christian teachings were produced by Paul. He kind of liked the Aristotelian view, and he basically made it part of Christian teachings. Jesus may not have agreed, but Christianity follows Paul. So basically, for about 23 centuries, between Plato in the 6th century BCE and the Enlightenment, which is the 18th century of the Common Era, no one of any note spoke on behalf of animals. I want to let that sink in. Almost 3,000 years. So the Enlightenment came in the 18th century in England, and it came in the form of British philosopher and social reformer named Jeremy Bentham. Bentham focused on sentience as the source of entitlement for moral consideration. His response to the Aristotelian view that animals are mere machines created by God to serve us was the famous quote that you've all heard. The question is not, can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer? And that impressed a lot of people in England. And the result was the formation of the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in the 18th century, and also eventually the National Anti-Vivisection Society. Oh my goodness, so much water.
Another one.
That's my.
Yeah.
And that's basically, notice how slow things are. It'll speed up soon, so this is now the end of the 18th century. So can they suffer? Okay, so we're concerned about suffering. So another 100 years goes by, and now they're suffering. So okay, so the Royal Society tries to alleviate the suffering. They take care of homeless dogs and that sort of thing. And then at the end of the 19th century, in 1889 or so, another British philosopher comes along and he says, well, that thing about suffering, yeah, that's impressive, but that's not enough. That's not enough. His name was Henry Salt, and he basically was the first person to initiate the concept of animal rights. He basically said it's not just about suffering, it's about rights. And then again, nothing happened for another 80 years. It's coming up. Be patient. Then things happened in America. 1963, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream. 1965, the Bloody Sunday, the march in Selma for voting rights, and the enactment of the voting rights of 1965 in August. And a woman named Bridget Brophy, who was fairly well known in England as a social reformer, writes an editorial for the London Sunday Times, a very prestigious publication, called The Rights of Animals, pretty much resurrecting the concept that was brought up by Henry Salt. And now it's picking up steam. There is a group of philosophers at Oxford University. So Bridget Brophy is 1965. By 1971, they come out with a book of essays called Animals, Men, and Morals. A couple of years later, one of them writes a review of Animals, Men, and Morals in a prestigious New York Review of Books. In New York, obviously. That catches a lot of attention of American academia. And they invite the young man to come and give a course at New York University about animal rights. This young man's name was Peter Singer.
Oh, Peter Singer.
Okay, now, yeah, like I said, things are speeding up now. You no longer have to wait 100 years for the next thing. So he, Peter Singer gets here in 1973. And he realizes very quickly that he writes very detailed notes for his book, for his course, I mean. And at one point he looks at it and says, this has the makings of a book. So he turns it into a book, which was published in 1975, called Animal Liberation, which you've all heard of, yes, soon. And again, remember the divergence between Bentham and Salt. That was reprised in the 19th century by Peter Singer, who was a follower of Bentham. See what happened, Roma? So what the reason Henry Salt came along and wrote his essay was, why wasn't he satisfied with Bentham? Because what happened as a result of Bentham, can they suffer, is people like the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals started reducing animal suffering. And Salt felt that was not good enough. So here again, Peter Singer brought up in Animal Liberation all of the abuses of animals, but his solution was basically to, again, following Bentham. So if you look up Peter Singer, he's somewhat known for being an animal rights philosopher, but his main claim to fame is as the most prominent advocate of a philosophy called utilitarianism, which we'll come back to very soon, which basically advocates reducing the suffering of the most sentient beings, basically following Bentham's original philosophy. That, again, just like Bentham was not good enough for Salt, Peter Singer was not good enough for another pioneer of our movement called
Alfred.
Tom
Reagan.
Reagan, who wrote many books, but the famous one is The Case for Animal Rights, where he lays out that it's not just about the suffering, that anyone who possesses sentience is loosely defined as ability to have feelings and self-awareness of being aware that you exist. That anyone with sentience is entitled to equal moral consideration. Okay, and we'll come back to that. All right, so this brings us, I'm getting a little ahead of myself because Tom Reagan's book was not till 1983. So back to 1975 with animal liberation. So there is something else that happened in 1975 that was very important, which was the first World Vegetarian Congress held in the United States. And the reason that was important was because it launched a number of local vegetarian organizations, about 60 local vegetarian organizations throughout the United States. And those local vegetarian organizations who were kind of, they were not animal rights organizations, but they were sympathetic. The idea of animal rights, a lot of people had read Peter Singer's book, and the idea of animal rights was already percolating. So there were a number of local activists in the 70s. So one of the most prominent ones was a fellow named Cleveland Amory. Is the name ring with anyone?
Yeah.
So if you can think of 10 of the biggest celebrities today, Cleveland Amory was all 10 of them.
Wow.
There was no one more famous than
Wow.
Cleveland Amory. The reason he was so famous was because so TV came in the late 50s. By 1960s, late 60s, every home had a TV.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to know what was coming in your TV, you had to have a publication called TV Guide. There was a TV Guide in every home.
Yep.
And on the back of TV Guide, there was always a column by Cleveland Amory. So everybody knew who Cleveland Amory was. So in 1974, Cleveland Amory was very fond of cats. So he wrote a bunch of books about cats. And so he became famous as an author in addition to the TV Guide. But in 1974, he decided to go beyond cats. And he wrote a book called Mankind, question mark, which was an indictment of hunting. And as a result of the book, CBS did a documentary called The Guns of Autumn, which basically caused social upheaval in this country. CBS was almost canceled. I mean, they had to apologize, and it was big. So that was Cleveland Emperor, and then of course once he read animal liberation, he became much more involved, and he was very helpful to me also. One of Peter Singer's students at New York University was a fellow named Henry Spira. Henry Spira did the first, was generally considered the father of animal activism. He did a very successful boycott of New York, the New York Museum of Natural History was doing cat blinding experiments, and Henry Spira was able to get them to stop by doing repeated picketing and writing to their donors. Anyway, another thing I almost leave it. Oh, Paul Watson. Got a you like Paul Watson?
An old friend of mine from Canada, an old friend.
Yeah. So Paul Watson was just kicked out from Greenpeace because he was too extreme. Because he wanted
Direct action.
yes, he wanted to go out there and
Help animals.
confront whalers. And Greenpeace thought that was too extreme. So anyway, so then Paul Watson started looking for money, and Cleveland Amory was not only famous, he was also rich. His idea of raising funds was to pick up the phone and call his rich friends. So he bought him a ship. And the two of them then proceeded to go out on the ice floes in Canada and save baby seals that were being caught by the harpers. Yeah. So anyway, those were some of the leaving out the important stuff here. There was also a young man named Alex Pacheco, who had served with Paul Watson on the ship and visited the slaughterhouse and decided to move to Washington and started trying to figure out what to do. And he figured if he enrolled at the university, George Washington University, he would not only get space for his activities, but he would also get funding from the Student Activities Fund. So he did, and he started this little student organization called People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And we became good friends, and he was actually influential in my becoming vegan back there in 1981. And one day he came over and he said, I have this idea of volunteering for the Institute for Biomedical Research and taking pictures and videos of what they do to the macaque monkeys there. So that's what was going on in the late 70s. So I was, at the time, I had already started an organization called Vegetarian Information Service. And one of the things I was doing was holding conferences. I'm kind of into conferences. And 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 there were, maybe a couple hundred people. They were not a big deal. But at these conferences, there were these people coming and talking about animal rights. And I thought that was a pretty strange concept. It was like somebody talking about rights of trees or rocks today. But what I like two things about it, three things. One is they were pretty smart. They kind of they knew what they were talking about. I was able to have a good conversation. Another is they were very enthusiastic. They were very energetic, and the vegetarian movement by then was about 5 years old, and things have kind of calmed down. Those 60 organizations that were formed were mostly social groups. They would have dinners and picnics, and I thought that we needed something more than that. So I figured, maybe we could. Oh, and the third thing I liked is that animal rights people were ending up in the same place, which is not to use animals for food. So I figured, okay, let's see if we can marry the enthusiasm of the animal rights people with the money and the manpower of the vegetarian movement, see what happens. So in 1981, I had one of my conferences, but this time I invited all the animal rights people. And they immediately took over. And that was basically the birth of the animal rights movement. All right, so a little bit of history. Okay, so next, what do we want? Yeah, I know, animal rights.
When do we want it?
But it's not so simple. So so for the first 4 decades of our movement, the movement was pretty evenly split between animal welfare people who were basically followers of Bentham and Peter Singer, and animal rights people or animal liberation people who were followers of Tom Reagan's. And we would have debates and so on, but it was kind of peaceful. And then in 2016, a new a fellow named Dustin Moskowitz, who we've never heard of, whose claim to fame was co-founding Facebook, retired with several $billion. And his wife decided to start a foundation called Open Philanthropy, which basically sponsors utilitarianism. And they've been putting $40 million a year into 3 organizations: Mercy for Animals, Animal Equality, and the Humane League. All 3 organizations are about the size of a farm, like a dozen people. and overnight they became, the staff grew to several hundred. Well, and $40 million,
Mhm.
it goes a long way. That's 100 times the budget of pharma. So, that's sort of okay. So that's where the money is in the movement today. Now, what about the rest of us? Okay, so you said animal rights. Well, animal rights has two problems. One is philosophical, legal, which is normally rights also imply obligations. Generally, in exchange for having certain rights, you agree to certain conditions of your society, and we'll get into it a little more. Now, animals have a limited ability to form social contracts. I mean, your dog forms a social contract with you that no, it's not going to poop on your favorite sofa. It's going to welcome you when you come home from work. And, if he doesn't meet that social contract, you may not want to hang on with him. Uh, but it's a very limited social contract. And it would be very difficult to enforce it for a number of other animals. I mean, once you go down to raccoons and bears and mice and rats and so forth. So it's a nice philosophical concept, and it's not very practical. But the biggest problem with advocating animal rights is that it requires people to change their lifestyle 3 times a day. And so we figured, okay, so let's get them to stop eating animals first, and then we'll tell them animal rights. And animal rights, so the concept of animal rights is easy for except for the eating part. It's easy because humans have a natural affinity for animals from our earliest childhood days. The very first toys we handled were animal toys. The very first stories we heard were animal stories. The very first movies we saw were stories about animal lives. So we have that almost inborn affinity for animals. And then roughly the age of 4, our parents sit us down and say, well, the dog on the sofa, that's to be cherished and cared for and loved. But the pig on your plate is to be abused and killed and cut into small pieces and consumed as food. Okay. Now this does two things. It introduces the concept of discrimination, because to a 4-year-old child, a pig and a dog don't look all that different. I mean, they have 4 legs and stuff. So the child learns that just because two creatures look similar, it doesn't matter, that society still has the power to decide that one lives and one dies. It's not just about animals. I mean, that the social norms in Nazi Germany, where the Christian lives and the Jew dies. So it's very, very arbitrary, and that the germ, that the first notion that you can discriminate between two living beings, sentient beings, that is introduced to every child roughly at the age of 4. So anyway, we have this affinity, this inborn affinity towards animals. And also, people kind of see the connection between human rights and animal rights. I mean, it's not that big a jump if other things being equal, if it doesn't cost them anything, if they don't have to do anything about it. So once the eating part is out of the way, the animal rights should not be a difficult concept to get across. So the idea was, okay, let's drop animal rights and let's just talk about veganism. And then once we get everybody to go vegan, then we'll tell them about animal rights. Well, the problem was that the vegan diet has two problems: vegan and diet.
Exactly.
So the concept of diet is associated with illness. It's associated with restrictions, with deprivation, with withdrawal. So it's not a very popular term. Now the term vegan has had a bit of history from where nobody knew what it meant when I got started, to the point where almost everybody, certainly anybody in the food industry, knows the term vegan when it's associated with eating. So vegan food, vegan restaurant, vegan menu, vegan ice cream, vegan cheese, not a problem. Everybody knows what they mean. Nobody has a problem with it. Vegan people, that's a different story. We, deservedly or not, we've gotten a bad rap. So without going into details, we have not done well. So then the next solution was, okay, so let's keep the vegan diet part away, and when we have to refer to it, if it's a food situation, we'll call it plant-based eating. If it's an animal situation, we'll call it animal-free eating. But we'll just avoid the vegan part and just get people to stop eating animals for whatever reason. Okay, but that has a problem too. And that is, as soon as you start getting off your philosophical high chair and start dealing with the real world, you very quickly realize that if you're going to change people's eating habits, you pretty much have to work with the meat industry, because the meat industry owns basically all the channels of food distribution. And that's, and they're open to it because they're not married to killing animals, they're married to making money. And if they can be convinced, that some are, that they can make money selling plant-based foods, they're okay with it. But it involves, it involves basically working with the enemy, so to speak. I mean, for those of us who are very ideologically oriented. All right. So those are some of the issues in trying to decide what do we want. And which brings me into the final part, which is winning hearts and minds. How do you get people to follow your lead, to agree with you? So there are two very important concepts here. One is the concept of choice, and one is the concept of social norms. So the word choice has two meanings. It means that there are many options. It also means a decision. So, for example, you could say, I went to the supermarket and I looked at cereals and I had many choices and I chose this cereal. So, how do we structure our lives? So, most of us, most of us are surprised to find out that we don't really make a lot of choices. That our lives are pretty much chosen for us. By circumstances, by our parents, I mean, if you think your birthplace, your religion, your school, your hobbies, your interests, how you came about them, if you really look back, you'll realize that you didn't sit there. So say in interest, you didn't sit there, go on the internet and look at the 200 possible hobbies you could have, and then you narrowed it down to the top 10, and then you picked maybe the two top ones. Typically you got into a hobby because somebody got you there, or you were born somewhere because your parents happened to be living there, so forth. There was a famous movie in 1998 called Sliding Doors. Somebody remember that? And it's Gwyneth Paltrow is the main actress. So she is fired from her job, and so she goes home early, and she catches a train, just catches the train, sliding door, and goes home early because she was fired, finds her husband in bed with another woman. So then the movie rewinds, and she doesn't catch the train. She misses the train, and then she gets home 2 hours later. The woman is gone. She has a whole other life. But basically, the notion here is that little silly incident like that, 2 seconds of catching the train or not catching the train, shapes her life forever for the rest of her life. So Melanie Joy made an important contribution by coming up with the concept of carnism and basically pointing out that eating animals is a choice that you can make. that just because you have been eating animals and because your parents and your friends and everybody else around you is eating animals, that doesn't mean that you have to, that you have the power to choose not to. If it's not normal and natural, it's a choice. There is a very interesting not experiment, but a study that was done in many years ago in Western Europe. They found that in some countries, a lot of people, when you get your driver's license, just like in America, you can decide if you want to be an organ donor. And in some countries, most people were opting to be organ donors, and in other countries, neighboring countries, most people chose not to be organ donors. And they said, how is this possible? These countries share everything. And how could they make such stark, different choices on something so basic? And they found there were two things. They found out that in one case, in order not to be an organ donor, they had to opt out. And in the other countries, to be an organ donor, they had to opt in. So basically, the clerk who designed the form was making the choice for them. Think about this.
Default.
But there's more. They then they asked these people, why did you make that choice? And these people argue. They developed the whole rationale why they made the choice, even though the choice was made for them by the clerk who designed it. But because they now owned that choice, it became part of who they are. And they felt that they had to defend it because it was part of them. Sam Harris, I don't know if you know Sam Harris, he's one of my heroes. He basically has decided, and I must agree with him, that people don't use their reasoning abilities to come up with choices, with good choices. They use their reasoning ability to defend the choices that were made for them. That's kind of discouraging, especially in our effort. So anyway, but I wrote a whole essay about this in theveganblog.org. It's number 19. It's called The Enigma of Choice. All right, the other important concept is social norms. So social norms are basically a contract that you make with the society that you live among, and it basically ensures that a lot of people can live very close to one another without inflicting grievous harm on each other. It's a set of rules that everyone is expected to abide by, and it's what makes initially tribes and today cities possible. Now, social norms, as I pointed out earlier, are very capricious and arbitrary. As for the example that the dog lives and a pig dies. That's our society's decision. But social norms change. And that's where our hope lies. We no longer drown witches, we no longer practice slavery, and we no longer ban gay marriage. So, how do we change social norms? Well, every social scientist has their own way of talking about changing social norms, but I, I try to keep it simple. I talk of three stages: the alerting stage, the discussion stage, and the implementation stage. So during the alerting stage, people don't realize that the problem exists. And with animals, there are some issues are at different stages. So, for example, I don't know if you're into mice, but it's very difficult. I mean, there's hardly anybody today who thinks that you know that mice should be done anything but extinguished. I mean, it's not. Nobody is talking about saving mice, so it's a non-issue basically. So if you're concerned about mice and rats, then you would be, if you're trying to change that social norm, then you would be in the alerting stage. Zoos sort of fall in that category. Now, most people think, zoos protect animals from predators. They get 3 meals a day. They get veterinary care. No, what's wrong with zoos? So those are a couple of examples of where an issue is. I mean, people don't view it as an issue. So that's the alerting stage. Next is the discussion stage, where people realize that there is a problem, but they're not about to solve it. So hunting would be an example. I mean, most people realize that hunting is controversial, but nobody is ready to start banning hunting. And then finally, the implementation stage. So what happens? The implementation stage is kind of interesting because in the implementation stage, most people agree with you, but still things are not happening. So, like, I don't know how you feel about the guns, but, almost everybody thinks that we should have stricter background checks, but, we can't get those through Congress. So there are a number of things like that. Most actually with animal consumption, I think it would be difficult to find anyone who is willing to argue with you that using animals for food is desirable. They may give you arguments that they've always done it, that it's tradition and so forth, but nobody can really argue that it's good. So, but still, even though most people agree with you, it's still not being implemented. Okay, so how do we move that? Well, there are two remedies, two types of remedies. One is what's called tipping points, and these are usually books, but not always, that move things from the alerting stage to the discussion stage. In other words, they raise the public consciousness to a problem. And a couple of examples is the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, 1905, which actually kind of backfired or misfired. So Upton Sinclair was very concerned with the condition of the immigrant workers in the Chicago slaughterhouses. And strangely, despite the huge influence his book had, migrants still work under very similar conditions in slaughterhouses, not in Chicago, but elsewhere. Uh, and there was also, of course, a number of us were hoping that it would put some reduce the slaughter of animals, but it didn't do that either. What it did do is it showed how unsanitary slaughterhouse conditions are, and it led to the formation of the Food Safety Agency. So that's one example. Another was another book, A Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, 1962, which is credited with basically launching the environmental movement. So these are examples where books served to change social norm from the alerting stage to the discussion stage. The other category is what's called trigger events. These are events that take social norms from the implement. Remember, I said that things set in the implementation stage for a long time, where everybody agrees with you that things don't get done. Well, trigger events is what makes them get done. So there are lots of examples. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where 146 young women were burned to death because the building did not have fire escapes. The doors were locked, so they wouldn't go out for cigarette smokes. And that, of course, led to the formation of OSHA and greater protection for workers. Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965, in Selma, Alabama, led almost immediately within March to August, within 4 or 5 months to the enactment of the voting rights of 1965. And the shooting of the 4 Kent State University students in 1970 basically brought an end to our participation in Vietnam. So the question is, what about animals? Have there been any animal trigger events? Well, yes. I mentioned one of them. In 1974, the 74 was Cleveland Amory's book, but the following year was the documentary, CBS documentary, that had the whole country up in an uproar. And then the more recent animal trigger event was, remember my mentioning Alex Pacheco and his little student organization, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Well, he took his photographs and his videos, and he brought them to my conference in 1981. At the conference, he met Cleveland Amory. And Cleveland Amory saw those videos, and he basically became an overnight anti-vivisectionist, and got on the phone, called his media buddies, and PETA and the animal rights movement became front page news in America. That was huge. All right. Now, if you're asking me how to manufacture a trigger event, I don't. That's kind of a different subject. But short of trigger events, what can we do? Well, to change this social climate, to change the social norms. Well, things you've heard of, I'm sure. Letters to newspaper editors. So basically, what you're trying to do is you're trying to change public perception of certain topics. So letters to newspaper editors are good because you don't sound like an advocate, you sound like a neighbor, like a member of their community, and they're more likely to accept your views that way because you're not some strange advocate. Books and videos, of course, billboards. I mean, nothing really that you haven't heard before. Uh, the idea is whatever you do, make it look and sound like this is just who you are. It's not anything that you're forcing on anybody. Because people are willing to change what they do. People are even willing to change what they believe. They are much less willing to change who they are. So, if you're trying to impose a new status on them, which to us means vegan, they become very skittish. But being in Washington gives us a whole other avenue, which is lobbying. Much of the killing of animals for food is promoted by public policy, which is controlled by Congress. A couple of examples are subsidies for factory farms, insistence on animal products in subsidized food programs like school lunches, WIC, food stamps, and so forth. And promotion of animal products in the dietary guidelines for the United States that are produced every 5 years. What can we do about it? Well, it's actually a lot simpler than you may think. You basically go to your cell phone and punch in house.gov, find your representative, get the phone number, call him, ask for an appointment. Dress in business clothes, bring a friend or not. And you can get yourself educated by going online to faunalytics.org. Or if you don't want to take the time to get educated on what issues are pending before Congress, you can just act as the ingenue and ask the staffer that has agreed to see you. Uh, just tell them, make up some organizations with the Tulsa Animal Rights Society, and can you help me find out what can I do to get people to stop eating animals? Let let the staff member take the initiative and make suggestions to you. That way he'll take ownership of the issue instead of you imposing your issue on him. Uh, but it's the whole thing is 5-10 minutes, and you've made a contribution. Here's something that I find very helpful is the use of language. Remember I said that people are willing to change what they do and what they believe, but not who they are. But yet we're frequently using language that suggests that we want them to be somebody else. We use terms like converting, joining, graduating, signing up, transforming, right? Yeah. All those terms suggest to the listener, to your prospect, that you want them to be somebody else. So instead, what we want to do is we want to give them the arguments, tell them about you, and why you believe certain things, and then they have to make the decision about changing their habit. I already talked about changing the vegan diet to either animal-free food if you're dealing with animal issues, or if you're dealing with full plant-based food. Let's rescue the words meat and milk from the animal industry. And that's very simple. All you have to do is add a noun in front of it, indicating its source. Instead of saying meat, just say animal meat, soy meat, nut meat, cow's milk, or nut milk, or soy milk. Simple. Just qualify where it came from. And when you're referring to plant-based animal products or plant-based products that are, like ice creams and cheeses and so forth, don't call them fake
Right.
or analog
Right.
or mock or alternatives.
Substitution.
They are foods. They're not alternatives.
Exactly. They're not options.
And finally, we sometimes get very apologetic about our advocacy, and we sort of end up shooting ourselves in the foot by saying yes, vegan eating may be more difficult, but, and then you say why? No, it's not more difficult. It's more costly, but no, it's not more costly, and so forth. In other words, don't defeat yourself ahead of time. So, this is taking a little longer than I anticipated, so I have two more sections which I can skip because They are available on the internet under vegan, theveganblog.org. One is on personal advocacy, and one is on street advocacy. The Yeah, so, and of course, it would be awkward for me to be talking to you about street advocacy because Shannon here is the champion of street advocacy. And, and she'll be taking you through the steps in the next few days. So again, let me take this opportunity to thank you all for being here and for your attention and for letting me relive for 3/4 of an hour the wonderful experience of what the movement was like in the 1980s when we had a bunch of dedicated, enthusiastic, and energetic people. And I'm so happy to see you all here. And I see this as a kind of a rebirth of a very important movement. Thank you.
I know that was such a special treat. If anyone didn't get to eat beforehand,
I want to walk in front of you.